Regina is the MC. I'm Jessica Robinson. I'm just going to say very briefly that for those of you who don't know, uh, Angela Lloyd passed away recently. We're trying to honor her by dedicating tonight's show to her. And we will, at the end of the program, share a recording of one of her stories after the show is over. That way, for those of you who would like to stay, you can. And if you would rather not, you do not have to. But for right now, we are just letting you know that tonight's program is dedicated to Angela Lloyd. And if you'd like to stick around at the end of the night, we will say a few words and show a recording of one of her wonderful stories. We have 2 storytelling workshops starting soon. On February 1st, we have our half-day or 4-hour Spotlight on You 2 workshop online led by Jessica Robinson. Spotlight on You 2 is a workshop that is ideal for any experienced storyteller looking to delve a little deeper into a particular story or just play around a little bit more with form. Class size is limited to only 8 participants, so everyone will be working on sharing and receiving feedback on their stories. Your Story and More is a 5-week course starting on February 10th and wrapping up on March 10th. It is also online. It runs from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. weekly on Mondays, and it is also led by Jessica Robinson. These 5 classes will help you develop stories of varying lengths. So if you want to work on that solo show, this is a good workshop for you. But each class will also cover a different storytelling theme with the hopes that it will inspire new stories each week or inspire you to look at your story in a different way each week. We have 2 more in-person storytelling shows coming up before the Women's Storytelling Festival. What the Actual F, True Stories You Won't Believe, is at Epicure on King in Alexandria, Virginia on January 25th with MC Bonnie Gardner and storytellers J.R. Denson, Carol Moore, Jessica Robinson, Jack Shear, and Zach Wilkes. On February 22nd, we return to Claire and Don's Beach Shack in Falls Church for Mad World, stories about unreal people and situations, with MC Carol Moore and storytellers Dustin Fisher, Len Kruger, Gina Lee, Jamie Mickelhatton, Joe Maurice, Ravi Pimplaskar, and Kathy Stershik. We do record all of our in-person shows and we share the videos on our YouTube channels. So if you want to hear these storytellers and can't make it to Alexandria or Falls Church, you can always check out our YouTube channel. And finally, we have the 6th annual Women's Storytelling Festival. The festival kicks off on March 20th with a virtual-only showcase of performances and continues in person March 21st through the 23rd at the Sherwood Community Center in Fairfax City, Virginia. And the festival will once again be an incredible weekend filled with phenomenal storytellers. You can watch in person in Fairfax City or online. And to keep up to date on all of the upcoming storytelling workshops, shows, and the Women's Storytelling Festival, you could subscribe to our newsletter, or, of course, go to our website and click on the Events tab.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Let's get ready to rumble. Yes, it's that time. It is Fight Club, the moment you've all been waiting for. We have a great cast tonight, lots of stories, conflict, and strife. What could you want besides that? Who doesn't love a good fight? Tonight, we've got Lynn Ford, Savannah Clark, Sarah DeBeer, Janice Del Negro, Jackson Gilman, and of course, myself, Regina Stoops, your MC. Now, maybe you're a little confused because I'm usually in a little box that has the red, yellow and black around it for that other production company, 6 feet apart. But now I'm over here with Jessica. Claire is out of the country, so don't tell her that I'm stepping out on her because I've always wanted to do this. In fact, the prompt for this show, we always have a show, has a prompt, and the prompt for tonight is each of the tellers were asked the question, what is your big goal for 2025? What's the words that are the fighting words? Like, you're going to get this done. And so the answer to it for me is that my goal was to host a show on Better Said Than Done. And so, 9 days in, I'm crushing it already. So I can pretty much just coast the rest of the year. So that's for me. But we are going to get this party started. The first teller who's going to step into the ring, and by the way, I am the referee. I'm not the MC. I'm the referee, so I'll keep everybody settled down tonight. But our first contestant, well, it's not a contest, sorry, 6 feet apart. It's always a contest. Here, we're just all going to get along. But our first person to step into the ring tonight is Silvana Clark, and she wanted to let us know she's moving from the Pacific Northwest to Alexandria, Virginia. So Jessica, you're going to get her. And because she wants to spend more time with her adorable 2-year-old granddaughter, and who can blame her? But she's going to miss Mount Rainier. She's going to miss waterfalls in the backyard, and jigging in the rain. Now, I'm reading that off of the bio that I got. It says jigging in the rain. I think it means jogging in the rain. I'm not sure, but I think jigging in the rain is a lot funnier. So we'll let Silvana maybe explain what jigging in the rain actually is. Now, I know Silvana from 6 Feet Apart shows. She's been on many, many stages, a lot of Moth stages. In fact, she travels around the country and around the world and goes on stage at the Moth and brings the house down. So her prompt, the answer to her prompt, in fact, was she's traveled to 75 countries, and in 2025, she wants to go to 5 more. I've no doubt that she'll do it. Welcome, Silvana.
And it is jogging rather than jigging. All right, well, 46 years ago, way back in 1978, my husband Alan and I were starry-eyed newlyweds. We had a cute little house in San Diego. We had good jobs, but we wanted more. We wanted to change the world, and we were idealistic, and we knew we could change the world. So after hours of discussion and months of discussion, we decided that the best way to have an impact on the younger generation was if we worked full-time at a kids' camp, because then we could teach them about the environment. We could, show them how to do really cool crafts made out of popsicle sticks. Who wouldn't want that? Well, we found jobs as program directors at a camp in Seattle. And because we were idealistic newlyweds, we agreed that we would each work 60 hours a week for the princely sum of $300 for both of us per month. We weren't really thinking quite clearly then. So we went up to the camp and joined the camp there. And within a few days, we discovered that the camp had a very distinctive, conservative Christian vibe. Now, Alan and I were more the free-spirited, granola-eating hippie vibe. And I'd never grown up in church. In fact, in 6th grade, my girlfriend had a Bible, and it had this cool zipper around it. And I thought if you unzipped the Bible, God would come out. So obviously, I wasn't a Bible scholar. Well, our first assignment, the camp director said, you need to teach the story of the prodigal son to 200 middle school students. All right, and you all know the prodigal son. There's 2 sons, and they grow up on a farm. The younger son gets old. He wants his money. He goes off and carouses in the world, comes back, and the dad is so happy that his son is back, but his big brother doesn't like it. So we thought, how can we make this story relevant for middle schoolers? I mean, that's the key, right? Middle schoolers. So Alan and I came up with the idea that the 2 brothers, they grew up working in their father's pizza parlor, right? And so that's kind of was their life, working at a pizza parlor. And we made it into a little skit. And Alan was Ricardo. He was the younger brother. And we would act out that Ricardo was making his pizza, and a customer would come in, order a pepperoni pizza. And then Ricardo would say, thank you for your order. I'm making your pizza, I'm making your pie, chopping the onions, making you cry. I mean, it's cute, right? And then we had Ricardo going off, and he joined a gang of motorcycle bandits. The camp director was furious. Now, the camp director and his son, they were the directors of this program, and he was so mad at us for doing this. And he said, "You stick straight with the Bible. You don't veer off the Bible story." And I mean, you could just see his face bulging. He was so mad, and we thought it was rather cute. Well, a week later, the camp director tells me, "Savannah, in a couple weeks, we need you to find a missionary who can talk in the morning and in the evening to about 200 elementary school students. So we want you to find a missionary, and that missionary also has to come for free." Well, thankfully, I had a good friend, Dave, who had been a missionary in Ecuador, and he was also a great athlete. So we had it planned that he could come, he would stay there for the week, and in the morning and in the evening, he would talk to the elementary kids about, some sports analogies and team building, and then also share his experiences about Ecuador. I mean, it was perfect, right? Now, Dave also had been recently married. So I went to the camp director and I just casually said, "Oh, I assume that Dave can bring his wife so they can be together during the day." And the camp director said, "No, we don't have enough food for her." And I said, "There's always extra food." And he said, "No, he has to come alone." And Dave graciously came, spent the week away from his new wife to be at the camp and tell his experiences as a missionary. And I'm just furious the whole time. And my husband and I kept seeing all these little incidences of that this camp was certainly not the loving camp you would think at a Christian camp. Well, the next week, 250 high schoolers descend upon camp. And I'm watching as five of the guys, they're setting up their band equipment on this big stage that we had. And they were part of the worship team. So they were supposed to sing Christian songs and then 250 high schoolers sing along. But usually the high school bands, they just like to be up there and play their instruments and flirt with the girls, but that's okay. And one of the boys helping set up, we'll call him Stephen. He was a little different. Back in the late 50s and early 60s, doctors often prescribed a drug for pregnant women to help with morning sickness that was called thalidomide. Unfortunately, thalidomide had never been tested on pregnant women, and they quickly found out that there were thousands of horrible birth defects caused by thalidomide. And Stephen's mother had taken thalidomide. So his one leg kind of twisted out. His other leg was about 3 inches shorter. His right arm ended at his elbow where he had three fingers, and his other arm was pretty normal, but then he had severe curvature on his back. And Stephen had a specially designed chair that he used when he played the drums. He was amazing. At night, I watched a drum solo, and 250 high schoolers are going, "Stephen, Stephen." I mean, he was a rock star. He was amazing. It was amazing. Well, that later that night, Stephen's best friend came to me and said, "Hey, Stephen's a little embarrassed to ask, but is there a place he can take a shower in private?" And I said, "Oh, sure. We have some cabins when adults come, so let me just get a key." I go over to the camp director and his son, and I said, "Hey, Stephen would like to take a shower in private. Where can I get a key for a cabin?" And the camp director says, "Why does he need to shower in private?" And I said, "Well, I think it's obvious why he'd like some privacy." And the camp director's son says, "Well, no. Handicapped people don't want to be, they want to fit in with everyone else. They don't want special accommodations." And I say, "Stephen is fitting in quite well at camp, and it isn't really special accommodations to give a 16-year-old boy in his condition a private shower." And then the camp director says, "It'll be too much work for housekeeping." I push back and I say, "I will clean the shower, so there's no extra work." And the camp director says, "No, he can shower with everyone else in the group showers," because they were in a dorm and the showers are just on the wall and there's no privacy. Well, I'm just raging inside. I go up to Stephen and I say, "It's all set. You can take a shower in my cabin. Let us know when you want to take a shower and we'll be gone. You have complete privacy in the whole cabin." And he was so relieved. So for the next week, every morning, Stephen took a shower in my cabin, and every night he brought the house down with his drum solos. And to hear all those kids screaming and yelling for him, I kept thinking, this is what camp is all about. On the last day of camp, The camp director saw Stephen coming out of my cabin with wet hair. Camp director came up to me and said, "I thought I told you that he should shower with everyone else." And I say, "I thought I told you it's common decency to give him some privacy." He glares at me. I glare back. And then he says, "Come to my office tomorrow before dinner." And I say, "I'll try to work it in my schedule." Well, the rest of the day and in the next day, Al and I are going back and forth. Should we quit this camp? I mean, we want to change the world. Could we start here? But then we thought, the camp director's retiring in 3 years. His son is taking over, so the leadership would stay the same. Plus, the camp was financed by a very conservative denomination. But then, if we left, we had very little money because we sold our house barely breaking even in San Diego. We had no jobs. We had no place to live. I mean, what would we do? We'd drive out the driveway not knowing what to do because we were basically homeless and penniless. We talked and talked. Next day, we walked into the camp director's office. He's sitting behind his desk. And the first thing he says is, "You two are fired." And Alan and I looked at each other and we smiled and we walked out because we had already made the decision that we were going to leave that camp. Thank you.
Knock out, Silvana Clark. Thank you so much for that story, Silvana. As a former camp worker, I can appreciate all that you went through, except without the Christian part. Thank you. Thank you for that story. You always have adventurous stories. I love it, Silvana. And if you like Silvana, and how could you not, she will be in another round. And this one is a knockdown, drag out fight. It's the 6 Feet Apart Stellar Slam on February 12th. You can go to sfapshows.com and Silvana will be in that. So come out and see Silvana as well as the rest of the tellers. So our next, bringing up to our ring, our next storyteller is Sarah DeBeer. And in 1978, Sarah was working for a library outreach program, telling stories in city parks. But then by 1980, she had received a fellowship from Yale and was traveling to Ireland to listen to traditional tellers. And since then, she hasn't looked back. She's never stopped telling folk tales to listeners of all ages. Sarah is also a published poet, and I believe if you look in the chat, you'll find out more information about Sarah. Now, the prompt, again, what's your big goal for 2025? What's the battle you're going to fight? And Sarah's response was, she is going to battle her way through revising the poems she's planning to publish in her third book of poetry. And as someone who's had it as a goal to write a book for the last 142 years, I commend you, Sarah, 100% for doing that. So best of luck to you. I'm sure you're going to get it done. But in the meanwhile, step into the ring and let's go, Sarah.
So I was thinking about fighting, and I was thinking about the choices that we make about when to step in, when to fight, when to decide this is not the moment for a fight. Where does justice, how does justice fall into that equation? So I have two stories for you, both from West Africa. This first one is from the Gindo people of Mali. And they say there was once a king, King Kananjang, and he was the king of all the Gindu people, and people came to be in his presence. Musicians came from all over to perform for him. And there was, in a very small village, there was a musician who frequently other people in the village would come up to him and say, you should go, you should perform for King Kananjang. He would love your music. And the musician was not so crazy about the idea, but people kept encouraging him. And at last he got very excited because he loved to play his chorale, his harp, and he loved the songs of the heroes and the lovers and the kings. And so he met that long, long trip to Benghazi, the city where King Kananjang's great house was, his palace, and he was invited in, and he began to play, and he sang one song after another, heroes and adventures and lovers and adventures and kings and adventures. And when he at last finished, the king clearly was pleased. And he looked down at that musician and he said, I don't believe I've ever seen you before. What brings you here to the capital? I came just to give you pleasure, to play my music for you, and I was hoping if you had enjoyed the music, if you would give me some token that I could bring back to my village and show them that you heard me and you enjoyed what I performed. Give you something? You mean you want to be paid for performing for me? Do you not know that musicians come from all over just for the honor of having me listen to them? You want payment? I will pay you. And he turned to some of his servants and he said, take this man. I will pay him with 500 lashes of a knotted rope. And they took the musician. And he was whipped 500 times with a knotted rope. And then very slowly, very painfully, he made his way back to his village. And at last, when he arrived there, people began to tend to his physical scars and sores. But his fellow musician, Gamili, he was filled with rage at the way his friend had been treated. And when he filled with rage, the only thing he was capable of doing was sitting down with his kora and playing out his rage. And as his rage came through his mouth, a melody that I cannot reproduce came out, but the words he sang, I can tell you their translation into English. He decided that what would most hurt the king were words mocking the king, a song of contempt of the king. And so the words that he sang were, Kananjang, king of the Gindu. He is fat, his neck is flabby. Kananjang, king of the Gindu. His teeth are few, his legs are swollen. Kananjang, king of the Gindu. He is bald, his knees are bony. Ha, ha. So that sounds like a fighting song, but when it came from Gamili, it was infectious. And he began to travel from village to village, and no one could resist the excitement and the indignation that were deeply woven into that song. And it began to be sung from village to village. Women sang it as they were grinding grain, and young girls sang it as they were carrying jars from the river back to their villages, and men sang it as they were working in the fields. And it traveled to the ears of King Kananjang. And he said, that song, why are those people singing that song about me? How dare they sing that song about me? And when he heard the name of the village where the song had originated, he remembered that musician. And so he sent for the musician. And when the musician arrived, he said, "Look, I have gifts for you. I have an ox. I have a goat. I have 100,000 cowrie shells. These are your gifts that you asked for. So now make the people stop singing that song." And the musician said, "Your Majesty, now you are giving me all these gifts. But when I was here before, you chose to have me whipped 50 times with a knotted rope, and more and more and more until I could barely feel them 500 times. And you cannot take those back." My friend Gamili did not have to make that song, but he chose to. He cannot take it back. If you, the king, the powerful king, cannot make the people stop singing the song, how can I, a poor musician, persuade them to stop singing? The song has entered their ears. The song has entered their lives. And there was nothing that the king could do. And that song lasted long after King Kananjong, and you may even hear it today. So Gamili chose to fight injustice with a song. And this next story I want to tell you about, it's a different kind of injustice, a different kind of choice making. And to hear that, we travel to Nigeria, to the Yoruba people. And it is said there were two young women who had been friends since before they could walk. And they grew in the same village, always the closest of friends. And when each of them married, they married men from their village, and they continued as women to work side by side to help one another, until one day, one of those women found a kola nut. A kola nut. Something very rare. Something used in rituals, spiritual power. She had never had a kola nut, but what she chose to do was to take it and plant it in the ground. And it sprouted and began to grow. And she was so excited, and her friend was excited as well. But there were animals that were threatening to eat it, and they talked together. And her friend said, "I have a large ceramic jar, a clay pot, and the bottom broke from it, and yet the walls remained intact. I saved it. I never really understood why, but now I know why. We can place it over top of that small plant of the kola tree, and it will protect. And yet there is enough space there so that when it grows tall and strong, it will be able to still have space. It will not grow outside of that jar." And indeed, that was true. And then that tree grew far faster than they had expected. And suddenly there were kola nuts. And the woman who had found the kola nut, she picked them and she brought them into market, and she was amazed what people paid for them. And she kept the payment to herself. And so she was growing richer and richer, and she was not sharing any of that with her childhood friend. her childhood friend watched, and she felt a kind of resentment and an anger. And that anger began to brew into a hatred, and the hatred whispered into her ear. And she went to that friend of hers and she said, "You know, I have been missing my clay pot. I would like it back. And I would like it back exactly as I gave it to you. I don't want you to break it. I want it back, just as it was when I brought it to you." But that's impossible. The only way that you could get that pot back would be if I cut down my tree. Well, then I suppose you'll have to cut down your tree. Well, they went to the chief, and he said they must cut down the tree and give the clay pot back to the woman whose it had originally been. And she was satisfied. But the woman whose tree had been cut down, she grieved over the loss of her tree. And that grief began to twist into anger. And that anger began to grow into hatred. And as that anger began to grow into hatred, her friend had a baby. And the hatred whispered in her ear, and she went to a man who made things of brass, and she got a brass ringlet for a child's neck. And she went to that friend, and she said, "This is a gift for your baby. Place it on your child's head. Let it rest around your child's neck. Oh, it looks beautiful on my baby." But that child grew. That child grew, and that woman waited. And then when the child was around 9 years old, she went to the mother of that child and she said, "I have decided I want my brass ringlet back." What are you saying? It does no longer fit over her head. Well, you know how you forced me to cut down my cola tree so that you could get your clay pot? I want my brass ringlet back, whatever way we must go. And so they went to the chief. And the chief looked at those two women, and he said to the mother of the young girl, "You made a choice. You forced us to cut down that cola tree to get back your clay pot. You must give that brass ring back to this woman." And the mother began to shriek and cry. But the friend looked down. But when she looked into that frightened child's face, what she saw was the face of her childhood friend, whom she had loved so deeply. And she said, "Wait, I cannot cause the death of a child." Please forget it. Leave that brass ring where it belongs. And please let us find a way to rebuild our friendship. And somehow they did. Sometimes we are able to rebuild friendships that have been broken. And you know, it may be that they found a kola nut and they planted a tree. But I know that much joy grew from their friendship. And thank you. You're muted, and I only see your glasses.
I'm muted. I'm not sure what happened. Here, let me have these two guys talk for me. Okay. So let me just synopsis of Sarah's beautiful stories. They got into a fight. He said, I'm going to cut off your head. I'm going to cut off your plant. No, let's get along. No, okay. Thank you very much. No, Sarah, thank you so much for those wonderful stories. And phew, I was a little concerned there on the second one, but whew, I'm glad that it had a good resolution at the end and a great message. And thank you so much for that. Now, if you liked Sarah's story, and again, why wouldn't you? You can hear her on 6 Feet Apart show. I know I'm plugging 6 Feet Apart, but sfapshows.com on January 15th. It's Once Upon an Open Mic, and Sarah will be telling a story. So you can tune in for that for more Sarah. Now, I also want to say that if you want to contribute more to our tellers, what you can do is spread the word about this show, because ticket sales are going to continue through Sunday night, and folks can buy that. And I think they've got at least a couple weeks to watch the show after they've bought their tickets. So support these wonderful storytellers and the artist storyteller, spread the word, and let folks buy a ticket to the show. Next up in the ring is Jackson Gilman. Jackson Gilman. And earlier in Jackson's performance career, a coach challenged him to portray a character that was very different from himself. And so the story Jackson's going to tell was prepared 40 years ago to perform in a prison. Now, in the story, he plays this big, loud, rough and tumble guy. And you might not be able to tell when you see Jackson on screen, but he's actually quite small and soft-spoken. But he wanted to challenge, and he took that challenge. And also, this story is written by Shel Silverstein and is called The Winner. Now, back to the prompt of what's your big goal for 2025? Jackson's goal is one that many of us can understand. We've all had it, whether we've done it or not, but his goal is to declutter. I don't know if he means his office, his house, his mind, his garage, but regardless, declutter is the goal for Jackson, and we wish him success with that. So please welcome to the ring, Jackson Gilman.
All right, yeah. Fill him up, man. All right, ready, set, go. That one's on you. Next round. What? That guy. Yeah, forget it. Come on. The hulk of a man, with a beer in his hand, looked like a drunk old fool. But I knew that if I hit him right, I could knock him right off that stool. But everybody said, hey, watch out. That's Tiger Man McCool. He's had a whole lot of fights. He's always come out winner. Yeah, he's a winner. But I'd had myself about 5 too many, and I walked up tall and proud. And I faced his back, and I faced the fact that he never stooped or bowed. And I said, Tiger Man, you're a pussycat. And a hush fell on the crowd. Why don't you and me go outside, see who's the winner, huh? He gripped the bar with one big hairy hand, and he braced against the wall, and he slowly looked up from his beer. Oh my God, that man was tall. Boy, I see you're a scrapper. So just before you fall, I'm going to tell you a little what it means to be a winner. You know these bright white smiling teeth of mine? Now, they ain't my own. No, mine rolled away like chiclets down the street in San Antone. But I left that person cursing, nursing 7 broken bones, and he only broke 3 of mine. That makes me a winner. And behind this grin, I got a steel pin that holds my jaw in place. It's a trophy of my most successful motorcycle race. And every morning when I wake up and touch a scar across my face, it reminds me of all I got by being a winner. Now, this broken back, that was the dying act of a handsome Harry Clay. That sticky Cincinnati night, I stole his wife away. But that woman, she gets uglier and meaner every day. But I got her, boy. That's what makes me the winner. Hey, you gotta speak loud when you challenge me, son, because it's hard for me to hear. This twisted neck and these migraine pains and this cauliflower ear. And if it weren't for this glass eye of mine, I'd shed a happy tear. Know how much you'll get by being a winner. Yeah, I got arthritic elbows. I got dislocated knees from picking fights with thunderstorms and charging into trees. And my nose been broke so many times, I might lose it if I sneeze. And son, you say you still want to be a winner, huh? My knuckles are so swollen I can hardly make a fist. Who would have thought old Charlie had a blade taped to his wrist? A blind's eye where he cut me, a good eye's where he missed. You lose a couple things when you're a winner. My head is just a bunch of clumps and lumps and bumps and scars from charging broken bottles and button crowded bars. Oh, and his hernia. Well, it only goes to prove that a man can't lift a car. But you're expected to do it all when you're a winner. Now, I got a steel plate inside my skull underneath what's left of his hair. My pelvis is titanium from taking ladies' dares. And if you had a magnet, son, you could lift me right off of this chair. I'm a man of steel. Yeah, but I'm rusting. What a winner. Got a perforated ulcer, got strictures and incisions. My prostate's barely holding up from them all-night collisions. And I am going to have to fight 2 of you because of my double vision. Oh, what's the matter, son? You're looking sick. That ain't right for a winner. In the war, I got the Purple Heart. That's why my nerves are gone. And I ruined my liver in drinking contests, which I always won. I should be retired now, rocking on my lawn. But you losers keep coming on, making me winner. When I walk, I hear my pelvis rattle, creak, and crack from that great Olympic hump off with that nymphomaniac, after which I spent the next 6 weeks in traction on my back while she walked off smiling, leaving me a winner. Can't play violin. I can't dance or ski. They say there's never been a hero as brave and as strong as me. But when you're this year's hero, son, you're next year's used to be. And that's the facts of life when you're a winner. You remind me a lot of my younger days with your knuckles clenching white. But boy, I am going to sit right here and I'm going to sip this beer all night. And if there's something that you got to prove by winning some silly fight, well, all right. I quit. I lose. You're the winner. So I stumbled out of that barroom, not so tall and not so proud. And behind me, I could hear the hoots of laughter from the crowd. But my eyes still see. My nose still works. And my teeth are still in my mouth. And I guess that makes me a winner.
Thank you, Jackson. Thank you for that story about the winner. And it's hard to be on top all of the time. Just ask Jessica Robinson because she's up there so much and fighting to stay there. Hence the Fight Club. But thank you so much for that. Now, Jackson, I know you said that you had just a quick anecdote about the backstory for that particular story.
Well, I was actually, Shel Silverstein, people don't realize he wrote a lot of very adult things. He was often published in Playboy magazine. I was looking for a certain story of his called The Perfect High, and this was long before the days of Google and searches and like that. So all I knew is it was printed in a Playboy magazine, decades earlier. And so I had to find it, So I went into the place I found had all the back issues was in the back room of a hardware store, and I was going through the table of contents through all of these Playboy magazines still. I actually came across this particular piece, and I thought, oh, this one could come in handy. So it was I found it sort of through the back alley there, and
I say so. The rigorous research for that story was going through a lot of Playboy magazines. Is that really
yeah,
that's the summation of all that? All right. Well, you know what, you storytellers, you got to do what you got to do to get the information you need to tell a great story. So thank you so much for that. Well, we are on to our fourth round coming into the ring. We have Lynn Ford, who's been invited to return as a guest teller for the Supreme Court of Ohio and a teacher for the John C. Campbell Folk School. Her topic, These Haunted Hills, and she's not sure which job is scarier. And I get it, because small children scare me. You can see Lynn at the Ocoee Story Fest on February 7th in Cleveland, Tennessee. And I believe her contact information is in the chat if you'd like to contact Lynn or see more of what she's up to. And her answer to the prompt, that 2025, what's your big goal? Similar to Sarah's, she's determined to finish her first poetry chapter book and finally fix her website or build another one. And for any of us that have tried to tackle fixing a website, sometimes it's better just to sweep it all aside and start over from scratch. But we wish you good luck with Lynn, and welcome to the ring.
Yeah, thank you, Regina. I think I've been defeated by the website. When I was a little girl, there were two older women in the church who were a puzzle to me. Neither one had ever married. And if you had experienced their dispositions, I'm sure you would understand why. Being around them for even 5 minutes was a job. They had beautiful gardens and didn't want you to touch a single petal. Don't walk on the grass. Don't even look at things for too long. They were so much alike, and they couldn't get along at all. Whenever there was some gathering at the church, like a meeting to handle business, the two of them would disagree constantly, to the point where you would think that they were going to beat one another with their purses. They wouldn't dare do it with their hands. They always had their little gloves on, but those purses looked dangerous. And after a while, the minister or whoever was leading the meeting would tell them that they needed to go and think about the things that they were saying, or go and just calm down a little bit. And then they would argue with whoever told them that they needed to go. But there were times when there would be gatherings at the church for big dinners. And they would come and they could sit at the same table, sometimes side by side. They'd greet one another. They'd carry on conversations. They'd eat together, and there would be peace at that table. And I asked my grandma Jo how that could be. The answer she gave me makes me think of a story that I gathered when I was in a circle with others, and we were talking about peace. We exchanged stories, and this one comes from the Pacific Northwest, from the Tlingit traditions of storytelling. It's about a man who had lived for a long time in a great town. It was a good-sized place with lots of people, and yet he felt isolated, alone. He'd lost everyone that he had loved, and the only property that he had left was the small house where he lived, and he didn't seem to talk to the people who lived around him. He didn't seem to associate with anyone. And being like that, isolated from everyone, that man decided that it was time for him to die. Now, he couldn't seem to take himself out of the world, and so he came upon a plan. He walked to the place where he knew the great bears would come. They would walk down a certain path, feeding on the berries on either side of that path, reaching through the prickly branches and filling their great mouths. They would walk down that path to the creek to sometimes play in the water, and from there to the stream where the salmon would run, so that they could have a fine meal. Well, the man lay himself down on that path and waited for the bears to come. For the bears were the enemies of the people, and he figured that they would kill him. As he lay there, he started to hear sounds, twigs breaking, small branches cracking, and he thought to himself, the bears are coming. And then he thought, and that sound will be the sound of my bones being broken by the bears. He heard the rustling of leaves and wildings that grew in the grass along the path, and he thought, that will be the sound of my flesh being torn from my bones when the bears come. And well, he changed his mind. He got up from the ground, but before he could walk away, there were the grizzly bears, great, huge bears, fierce in their appearance. And before all of them was one who stood above them. He was much older, so old that his dark fur was tipped with silver. And as he approached the man tried to think of something that he could do. And finally, he just blurted out, "I invite you to a feast. Yes, I was here waiting for you. Tomorrow, come to my home in the town. I will have a feast prepared for you." Now that great silver-tipped bear seemed to think about this. And then he turned to the other bears, large and small, and he seemed to mutter and mumble in a growling tone, and all the bears turned around and walked back up the path with the silver-tipped bear behind them now. And the man thought, well, they didn't kill me. I think they accepted my invitation. And so he made his way back home. And along the way to his house, he spoke to people. For the first time in a long time, he said, I just want to let you know that I've invited the bears to my home for a feast. And the people responded in the way that they would. Have you lost your mind? You invited bears to your home? What is wrong with you? They will kill you. They may kill us. This is so dangerous. The man said, well, you're invited too if you'd like to come. But the people just turned, went into their homes, and decided that they would stay there the next day. The next day, the man prepared his feast. He swept his floors and cleaned his house. He made sure that the old sand was moved away from the hearth and fresh sand was placed there so that the fire would not snap away from its place in the hearth. He lit the fire and made sure that it rose high and warmed his home. He gathered the foods that he had kept for himself. Cranberries preserved in grease, all kinds of berries that the bears would love, and the salmon that he had for himself, and he put all of that into huge baskets. And then he decided that he would make himself more presentable, and he removed his shirt, and upon his arms he placed red marks, and across his shoulders a red line, and across his chest and over his heart, red lines. And then he waited at the door, and along came the bears. Now people peeked out of their homes, but they didn't come to his, and the bears came along with that great silver-tipped bear in front of them all. And the man greeted them and invited the oldest bear, that silver-tipped one, to come and sit before the hearth where he would be warm. And then the man invited all the other bears in, and they sat in a circle. Then the man passed around the baskets, but first to that silver-tipped bear. That great grizzly was the eldest, and that was a show of respect. And when that bear had eaten, he passed things to the others, who all enjoyed the food. And then the great bear seemed to stand, and he looked around at everyone, and especially at that man. And then he began to mutter, to grumble, to growl, as if he was talking. The man didn't understand a word that he said, but when he had finished, he walked toward the door. And the man went to the door to say goodbye to his guests. As the other bears passed, each one licked some of the red paint from his body, carrying with them a part of the man. Now, the next day along came a smaller bear. He came to the door and he said to the man, I couldn't speak to you when we were with the elder. You see, once I was like you. I was a baby, lost in the woods, and the bears, they took me in and made me their own. Now I am mostly bear, but I speak 2 languages. And so I wanted to come to make sure you understood what my great-grandfather was trying to tell you. You see, he wanted you to know that he knew you before he met you. For he has feelings as you do. You see, all his old friends are gone. He has no one from his younger life. And even when he is with the rest of us, there are times when he mourns for what he has lost and feels very much alone. And as you fed us, I don't know you realized how much you were telling us. He knew of the wounds in your heart, of the loss of your wife, of the loss of your children, and the loss of your property, except for this house. And he wanted you to know that he could feel what you felt. He also wanted you to know that from now on, when you are mourning, think of him and know that there is another who, though very different, feels like you. And then that little bear walked away from the village. And that did not mean that the bears and the man were friends. The man was still human. The bears were still grizzly bears. But they seemed to understand one another a little more. When I heard that story in our peace circle several years ago, I thought about my Grandma Jo and what she told me about those 2 older women. She said, the reason together at those gatherings was because those meetings without business, those meetings with food, are called the welcome table. And at a welcome table, all you sit together, whether you are different from one another or not. You eat and you share conversation. And in that conversation, you may find ways that you are alike. And at the welcome table, even though you may still be enemies, at the welcome table, there is no fighting. At the welcome table, there is always peace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. That's a beautiful story and a beautiful sentiment that we could all get along and accept our differences at the welcome table. I wish the world was just one big welcome table, but thank you for that. Beautiful. Before we bring up our last storyteller of the night, I want to say that tickets are on sale now for the 2025 Women's Storytelling Festival. Woo, woo. Early bird pricing is going to end on February 16th. So get your tickets while they are less expensive or cheap, or however you want to say that. If you want to save some moolah, get your ticket before the 16th, because it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful festival, as it always is. I believe it's the 6th annual that Jessica Robinson and her crew put on. Don't miss it virtual. And if you can be there in person, do that. I'm hoping to get there one of these years. I'm going to make it across the country and come live and in person for the Women's Storytelling Festival. Well, folks, you've made it through the battles, and we are coming up to our final round here for Fight Club. We're ready to go. Janice Stoney into the 398.2s as a child and never left. Now, I had to look that up. Okay, I'm going to admit it. I did not know what that was. I didn't know if it was like a Celsius, Fahrenheit. I was very confused. But it is actually the number of the Dewey Decimal System that's associated with folktales and folklore. So I learned a little something. Maybe you've learned a little something. And she really likes it there. She's a storyteller who excavates and decorates the bones of traditional folk and fairy tales. Her focus is reimagining traditional folk tales to make them emotionally resonate for contemporary listeners, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And the answer to her prompt was embrace the Mary. I think that's a wonderful sentiment to have as a goal for 2025. Embrace the Mary, embrace the welcome table. So let's bring up to the ring our final teller of the night. Welcome, welcome, Janice Denegro. Lovely to see you. Lovely to have you.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you. Wonderful stories tonight, everybody. Really lovely. A little frog hopped out of the royal bathing pond and spoke to me. It said, "Within the year, you will have a healthy child." I took this to mean that my child would be something out of the ordinary. The king's extravagance as an expectant father outstripped what he spent on his last war. His firstborn son and heir to his kingdom would lack for nothing. But the baby was a daughter. The king, bless him, did not lack for enthusiasm. He threw open the doors of the palace to relatives, well-wishers, friends, to come and celebrate the name day of our daughter, the Princess Briar Rose. The story as written says, the king invited 12 fairy godmothers to the christening. This is true, he did. Just 12. He had 12 golden place settings, so he invited 12 fairy godmothers. I told him repeatedly that there was a 13th fairy godmother, the oldest of them all, and she lived deep in the wood. She needed to be invited. Did he listen? Well, the story got that right, too. The christening was a 3-day wonder with sugar on top. And at its conclusion, the 12 fairy godmothers came forth to deliver their blessing to the child. The 11th fairy godmother had just given her blessing when suddenly Dreyitza, the 13th fairy godmother, swept into the hall. Now, Dreyitza was seriously irritated that she had not been invited to the christening. And she stood in the middle of the hall, and in a theatrical gesture, she pulled a spindle out of the air, spun it around, and she pricked her finger until there was one drop of blood on the tip. "The spell is cast," she said. "On her 15th birthday, the princess will prick her finger on a spindle and fall down dead." And then Dreyitza disappeared in a flash of lightning and a melodramatic clap of thunder. Honestly. The story as written says that the 12th fairy godmother softened the curse. "The princess shall not die. She shall prick her finger on a spindle, and she shall fall asleep for 100 years. Some gift. In reality, the fairy godmothers were very particular about their gifts, which is why Briar was more Briar than Rose from the very beginning. Oh, she was given the usual gifts, grace and charm and a cheerful countenance, but that was only 3. There were 9 more, but I digress. The king responded to the 13th fairy's ill wish the same way he responded to enemies at the gate. Scorched earth is not an overstatement. If spindles were the danger, then all spindles, all wheels, all looms, everything connected to them must be destroyed. The pile of wood reached as high as the castle roof. You could see the fire in the next kingdom blazing and crackling. While the king was setting the kingdom on fire, the fairy godmothers and I made other plans. In a forgotten hall at the top of the palace, we hung the walls with tapestries, put rugs on the floor, lit blazing fires at either end, and filled the space with wheels and spindles and looms, with thread and silk and flax. This is where Briar Rose spent most of her time, among the looms and her godmothers. And her godmothers, well, they gave her gifts. Briar, by the time she was 6, knew what a spindle was. By the time she was 8, she knew about the curse. When she was 10, she was a strong spinner. When she was 12, she was an accomplished weaver. No soft-fingered princess. She and those gifts. Well, one was that the princess would always know her own mind. That is, she would know exactly what she wanted and how to get it. She was also given persistence, good health, compassion, a discerning eye, a sharp ear, a talent for woodcraft, and a knack for cooking. The story as written says that on the destined day, the king and queen left the palace, leaving the princess all alone. Really? On the destined day? On the destined day, Briar was in the hall, surrounded by all of us, her 13 fairy godmothers and myself. Oh yes, 13. 13. How long do you think that Dreyitska could hold out against the gentle persuasion of the other 12? Honestly, Dreyitska, what were you thinking? Cursing an innocent baby with blood and spindles and drama. Really, if you come out of that tower once in a while, people would remember to invite you to things. Where is your sense of humor? Honestly. Well, quite honestly, Dreyitska felt kind of bad about it. As soon as she calmed down, she backed off the deadliness of the spell. Even she couldn't remove the spell entirely, blood to open the spell, blood to close the spell. But after a time, she had reshaped it just enough so that one single drop of royal blood would be needed. The result would be sleep and not death, and even that sleep would be very short. By the time the princess was 15 years old, that curse had been watered down so much, it would have been magic if the girl even took a nap. But the story as written says that on the destined day, she was left all alone. She was left alone, ignorant, vulnerable, and frightened. The story as written says that she pricked her finger on a spindle and fell asleep for 100 years. That a hedge of thorns grew up around the palace and that could not be breached for a century until the thorns turned to roses and a prince rode through the blossoms. The story as written says the prince either kissed the princess awake or she just woke up because the 100 years were over. The story as written says that it took 100 years for a prince to fix what the king had broken in the first place. Think for one moment. Briar's mother was a queen, and she had a baker's dozen of fairy godmothers. 100 years. As if. On the destined day, we were all there. At Briar's, on her 15th birthday, we were all in the great hall among the wheels and the looms and the godmothers, and Briar was all ready to prick her finger on that spindle, but I wasn't happy with that. You know, magic can be very tricky. But Dreyitza insisted it would only take 1 drop of royal blood. The result would be sleep and not death. Really, everything would be fine. And I said, royal blood, any royal blood, take mine. The godmothers were considering how that offer might impact the spell when the king, who had unfortunately been left to his own devices, was wandering around the palace and found the hall. And the first thing he saw was Briar, a spinning wheel and a spindle. Who has done this, he said. Who has brought this thing to this place on such a day? And he went forward with his hand outstretched. And that was when it happened. He pricked his finger on the spindle. A drop to open the spell, a drop of blood to close the spell. The king fell like a tree, crashing to the floor without a sound. Oh, don't worry, he was fine. I mean, he fell asleep off and on for a couple of weeks, but then after that, he really was okay. He still fell asleep during lengthy state functions, but then who didn't? Briar would never be queen. In this time and in this place, the only way to be queen was to have a king. And if there was a king, Briar could not rule even herself. Having the gift of always knowing her own mind, Briar set out for the dark of the wood. She moved into a crumbling tower with her 13th fairy godmother. Dreyitza, who was still feeling a little sheepish about losing her temper in such a public way, well, she was getting older. It was time to pass her knowledge on, and so she passed it on to Briar, who became as powerful as her godmothers and her mother wanted her to be. There are stories about a powerful witch in the dark of the woods, but you will have to look deep into the stories to find her. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Thank you very much. Wow, what a wonderful evening of stories. And if you'd like to hear more from Janice, there's the show that she runs, and it's called Traditions and Truths. It's a virtual open mic. I believe there's going to be links in the chat. You can take a look at those. If you'd like to see the show, if you'd like to maybe tell a story on the show, reach out to Janice, and she'll give you all the information. She's got a show coming up on February 1st featuring Bob Kangas, and March 1st featuring Tony Simmons. And I myself have been on the show. It's a lovely virtual stage, so I encourage you to check it out. Now, before we wrap everything up this evening, we are going to bring our wonderful storytellers back one at a time. We'll start at the top of the order so everybody can just give a wave and say hello. And there's Savannah. Hello, Savannah. Savannah, who told us a story about some camp conflict, Christian camp conflict. That's a better alliteration. Savannah, always lovely to see you. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
After Savannah, we had Sarah DeBeer. How are you? And lovely to see you. Thank you for the stories. Those 2 beautiful folk tales about conflict and resolution. Lovely. Thank you so much for your contribution for tonight.
Thanks. Hi, people.
And then after Sarah was Jackson Gilman, who told us the Shel Silverstein story, the winner, and the burden of what it is to be a winner. And boy, do I know that burden. So Jackson, thank you for that. Jessica and I both were kindled spirits in that. Claire Hennessy, not so much. All right. After Jackson, we had Lynn Ford, of course, and it was a beautiful story about, bears and the welcome table. I love that message, Lynn. Thank you so much. It's always lovely to see you. So thank you for coming on at the last minute and coming on the show. We certainly appreciate you.
Thanks so much.
And then rounding out the show, of course, we had Janice Del Negro, a very strong-willed princess who knew her mind and knew what she wanted and ended up powerful. And so we thank you for that, Janice. And I also want to say again, if you'd like to contribute, help out our storytellers, then all you need to do is tell your friends about the show, send them the link for tickets, because you can buy your ticket through Sunday evening and then watch the show for a couple of weeks after that. But thank you so much to our tellers. I'm Regina Stoops. It's been great being here tonight for Fight Club. Great stories. I love all the different the genres and just the different styles of storytelling. It was really a beautiful night. So thank you so very much. Have a good evening. If you want to stick around, of course you can, storytellers and audience, and we will be chatting afterwards.
Thank you so much, Regina. Great program, everyone. I am going to talk for a minute. For those of you who missed the opening, we dedicated the show tonight to Angela Lloyd, who passed away last weekend. If you would like to stay, I'm going to show a video in a moment, one of Angela's stories that she told for us about a year ago. We all, everyone who knew Angela loved her. It was impossible not to. She was a friend instantly. I got to know her about a year ago. No, I got to know her in 2020. Back then, we, right as the pandemic started, we started doing story swaps, and Angela came to one of our first story swaps. And I thought, oh, you know, this kid's got potential. She might make a storyteller one of these days. She was a fabulous storyteller, and so I invited her to come and start telling stories with us, which she did. And she told stories with so many of you, and she was always a delight. At the end of each year, we have a show about food, a show about love, because love is food and food is love. And we ask our storytellers for recipes. And our very first one in December of 2020, Angela was in that show. And I asked her for a recipe. And this is just, if you don't know Angela, I want to just read a little bit of the recipe she provided. This is for a recipe collection. She gave us the recipe for lemon chicken. And just like Angela, it starts off very straightforward. She says, this is my favorite whole baked chicken recipe. I learned it from an Italian cookbook. I cook it for guests and make it for Larry, and we enjoy the leftovers. And then she starts with the ingredients. You wash a whole chicken. You set it on a plate on an angle and let the water drain off. You shake salt and pepper on the inside, and then it progressively gets more and more interesting. Put the whole chicken in a baking dish. Bake it for 30 minutes at 350 degrees. There's time in this half hour to write a postcard to a friend or read a fairy tale laying down on the couch. Turn the chicken over in the baking dish and bake it for another 30 minutes. If it is summer and still light out, take your laundry off the line. Then turn the oven up to 400 degrees and continue baking. Stay in the house because the baking has fragrance. Read a poem or two. Ask someone to read them to you. Always read poems out loud with an easy walking pace. Take the chicken out and let it stand a few minutes before serving. It will be juicy, moist, savory, and yummy. Enjoy. Remember this, kissing don't last, cook and do. With love, Angela Lloyd. Angela had a lot of love. And with that, I think I'm just going to share her story now. There is no pressure to stick around and watch if you're unable to, but if you have not seen her storytelling before, I invite you to watch this story.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Mama thinks I'm living in a convent. 1980 summer, I traveled to Mallorca, Palma de Mallorca. My mother was there. She'd gone for 4 months. I was traveling with my sweetheart, David, and we'd gone to spend 3 weeks with her. I just finished 18 months on a government-funded equity union contract with a children's theater company. It was time to play. Summer. I'm wondering if it's happened to you where you participated in something in your life and then later you look back and it seemed to you perhaps someone had written a script, cast the roles, and you had played out your part, and it had been a grand design. My mother was in Mallorca for 4 months. My parents had decided to sell the house they owned there. My mother had a secret. She wanted to spend a month there before my father came over to visit. She would tidy up the house. She would put it all back in order. She would dust off the paintings I grew up with in our home in Caracas, Venezuela. She would reset the table her father hired a Navajo carpenter to make, the table that lived in our dining room in Caracas, Venezuela, where I sat at the stereo console listening to Mitch Miller singing along, reading the lyrics once I could read. That table was in Mallorca, the artwork we grew up with, other furniture, beautiful, precious objects. Everything had been moved to Mallorca in 1973, and my parents were going to retire there. But change, nothing is constant but change. And my father had changed his mind, and he wanted to sell the home. And my mama said, may I go and spend the summer there? And then you sell it. He said, go ahead. So she was there, and she did tidy up. She completely made it spotless with help. And then my father came over. They spent 2 glorious weeks together. And he flew home on the day I flew over with David. We would be there for 3 weeks. David was a gardener. So one of the things we did was plant the deep red roses in the garden. The garden was downstairs from the house. There was a small pool and then more stairs down into a beautiful garden that looked out over other homes and olive trees. Every day we walked the trash up to this road because that's when they would come every night to pick up trash in Palma de Mallorca, 1980. So it was always a small bag. It was always an evening walk after dinner. On one of the days, I found my mother's copy of The Prophet, and I'd never read it. It was her copy from college, and she drove us to the beach later that day. David and I spent the whole day there, and she picked us up in the afternoon, and I read The Prophet on the beach. I was used to reading on the beach, and often David would go for a run down the water's edge. He had a red bathing suit, just like my Ken doll. I didn't have my Ken doll in graduate school when I met David, but he had a red bathing suit, and he participated in runs and races, and I always had the t-shirts. He didn't, he had a lot of t-shirts. So those t-shirts I wore in grad school for dance class, cut them off at the mid so that I could see my body in the mirrors. David went for a long run, and I read The Prophet. And that evening, we did some more planting, mulching. We actually gathered pine needles on the way home, laid them down in the rose bed, and then we had a lovely evening at home. The next day, we went to gather with some friends in right walking distance, drinks with friends that live nearby. They were new to me, new to David. And then we walked further into town and had supper in a small little restaurant and then walked home. We sat on the terrace that night, that beautiful evening breeze. I know you know it, sitting outside, the wind on your skin. I'm going away to leave you, love. I'm going away for a while. But I'll return to you someday if I go 10,000 miles. The storms are on the ocean. The heavens will cease to be. This world will lose its motion, love, if I prove false to thee. Well, who will shoe your pretty little foot? And who will glove your hand? And who will be your own true love while I'm in a foreign land? When you go visit your mama in Palma de Mallorca with your sweetheart, you don't sleep with your sweetheart. He sleeps downstairs in the guest bedroom, and I was sleeping in the large king-size bed my parents shared. My father now back in Fort Lauderdale, and I was sleeping on his side of the bed. When we tucked in that night, I brought the copy of The Prophet with me. And I was telling my mom that I was thinking about the next time we would do a concert together. We'd done our first in the fall of '79. She'd been invited to Key Biscayne concert series to play a piano concert. Did I tell you she was a composer? Did I tell you she was a pianist? She invited me to do the concert with her. She said, maybe we could choose some poems. I would write a suite. And that's what we did. E. E. Cummings, Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay. We were very tired, one of hers. We were very merry. We'd gone back and forth all night on the ferry. And you ate an apple, and I ate a pear. My mother wrote a suite for piano, and she tucked them in 6 pieces of music, a minute and a half long, solo piano in between these groups of 4 poems, 3 poems, 4 poems by Garcia Lorca, Pedro Salinas, Pablo Neruda, in Spanish. Did I tell you I grew up speaking Spanish? When my mother wrote the program, she described herself as a composer pianist. And when she wrote the descriptor for me, she wrote Angela Lloyd Disuse, Disuse, disuse. Mama, I said, what is that? She said, it's a French word. I said, Mama, no one's going to know what that means. She said, let him look it up. And she made that gesture with her hand. Let him look it up. What does it mean? Someone who does solo monologue work, disuse. We loved doing that work together. I loved preparing those poems. Trained as an actor, I knew how to work with text, how to plant my feet, tell the truth. In bed that night, I said, Mama, I think I'd like to include some of these from The Prophet. I never read it before, Mama. I mean, listen to this. It says, work is love made visible. That's a good one, she said. I said, in this one, it says the children that are born to you, they're not yours. It is as though there is a ceiling and a porch and columns that hold it. The children come from you. They are of you. They are not you. You must let them go. I said, that's a really good one. I said, and look at this. The Pedro Salinas poem I said in Spanish, and she always did free translations for the program. it opens with, are you love, a long goodbye that never ends? To live from the beginning is to be severed. Mama, listen to this in the prophet. And ever has it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation. It's the same thought as at the end of the poem. Then there was one, well, my mom was getting tired. She was cozy in her nightgown, and she said, I'm going to go to sleep now. You can share more tomorrow. And she rolled over to sleep, to roll on her side. And then suddenly she rolled back and she gave me a kiss. Good night. And I remember that kiss. It had a lot of energy. I remember just in the moment thinking, whoa, that was a really nice kiss. It was a big kiss from my mother. And then I continued reading from the prophet. And there was a chapter that said, when joy is sitting at your table, sorrow may be asleep in your bed. That reminded me of a chant from Wind in the Willows. Mind you, my mother's going to sleep. I'm in bed, it's late, David's downstairs. And here comes this chant. Maybe it's happened to you, something you've known all your life. Wind in the Willows, the chant, the call outside a door. Villagers all this frosty tide, let your door swing open wide, though the wind be cold and the snow beside, yet draw us in by your fire to bide. Joy shall be yours in the morning. I read that rest of some of the passages, and then I went to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I got up early, scooted out of bed and went downstairs and told David not to go for his early run because we were going to go to the early church service at the Episcopal Church. And I came back upstairs to wake up my mother. And I couldn't wake my mother. I couldn't wake my mother. Would she sleep 100 years? I went down and got David. And David tried to wake my mother. My mother was asleep. We called the Episcopal priest. He told us, gave us the phone number. Well, he said he'd come over, 1. 2, he said, here's the phone number for the mortuary. You should call them so they could come. And so we made those calls, talked in Spanish, home sweet home. And then I went next door and told the women who lived next door to my mother that summer, who had lived there many years. You know, they washed their hair standing outside on the cobblestones and washed their hair upside down in a bowl, the dog sitting close by. In Palma de Mallorca, the roads are really slender. They're tiny, and the cars are tiny. And when the 2 men arrived from the mortuary, my first thought when I saw them was they look like Columbo's brothers, flapping black coats. And they got out of this tiny car and then opened the hatchback, and it almost was like a clown car at a circus. Like what else would come out of it? And they pulled out a long pine box and brought it in and laid it down next to my mother. And then they were like, ay, 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 este tamaño no se queda para ella. Ella es muy alta. She's tall, they said. This box isn't long enough. And they said, vamos a regresar con otro. I said, gracias. We'll be here. I remember thinking when they went left and came back, I remember standing in the living room, the grand piano in the living room, and thinking, I'll never hear my mother tell her point of view the story from her voice. I'll never hear that again. That's actually not true. But I do know this, that as years passed, I realized that I would always miss my mother seeing me. Did I tell you I was 26 when I was there? They came, and I realized before they came back that my mother was wearing her rings, and I took them off her hand. And I remember it was hard. It was difficult. I came back to Sarasota after my father came over. We were there 2 more weeks. We buried my mother in Mallorca. But I want you to know that I came back to Sarasota, Florida, and all I could think was, my mother initiated so much, so many opportunities of the concerts she played in her life, the recitals. She chose work, poetry she wanted to set. And I thought, if she could do that, perhaps I could do that I could make my way in the world by my making the first phone call, not waiting for someone to call me. And that's what I carried home. And that's how I've made my way in the world. And just a little side note, a story for another time. How do you get to Carnegie Recital Hall? You rent the hall. I just want to say that the thing about Cinderella going to the ball, and I know I'm jumping here, is that all Cinderella needed to go to the ball was to say she would like to go. And anytime I tell stories, my mother is with me. And I don't need to go to Carnegie Hall to do a concert on the anniversary of her concert, which I did apply to do, and they gave me the date. But my brother said, Angela, every time you tell, our mother is there. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise.